over halfway now in our EMEA sessions for today's conference, so some fantastic ones so far and plenty more to come. We've got a fantastic session now with Nicole Riley, who is going to talk to us about the art and the science of PMO, balancing those two to get the real magic sweet spot. If you've got any questions for Nicole, pop them in the question and answer section on the right-hand side of your screen, and you'll see a chat function there as well. So let us know you're here, let us know where you're joining from, maybe what time it is, because we're all over the world. And I've got to stop saying good morning or good afternoon, because it's all of them. Also, don't forget social media, pop online, let us know what you're doing, which sessions you've been to, what you're learning, and we're using the hashtag TPL conference today so that we can see all the good stuff that people are posting. So have a look on there. And after the session, not before, head on over to the booths and meet our brilliant sponsors as well. We've got Keydin, Planisware, Asana. They're over in the speaker booths, in the sponsor booths, sorry. Got a few digital freebies, but also the people that make this conference possible and make it free, along with our awesome speakers like Nicole. And that is enough from me, I think. Nicole is a director at the PMO Professionals. She's got 30 plus years experience in a wide variety of industries, as varied as finance and construction, and she's going to share her wisdom with us today. So I'm going to hand over to you, Nicole. Off you go.
Thanks very much, Jo, and hello everybody from wherever in the world you are joining us from, and for that lovely introduction, Jo. Welcome to the session today, which I want to invite you to take a journey through the life cycle of a change initiative and to think about the various different touch points of the PMO throughout that journey. So some sources of inspiration for today's presentation, a couple of books here. Think Again, which is The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know, where Adam Grant invites us to let go of some stale opinions and to prize mental flexibility and curiosity over what can be sometimes some foolish consistency. He suggests that in a rapidly changing world, the most crucial skill for us might be the ability to rethink and unlearn and reevaluate our opinions and decisions. It's not complicated. It's about the art and science of complexity in business. Rick Nason, the author, highlights that traditional modes of thinking aren't effective anymore in our new knowledge economy. He also suggests that compartmentalizing problems and solutions and suggesting that everything can be solved with the right formula can no longer keep pace with radical changes occurring in the daily modern business world. And some of you might also be familiar with Apple TV's recent show Severance, which explores what it might be like to separate or sever our consciousness between our work lives and our home lives. Now, this mind wipe procedure is something that's appeared in science fiction stories many times over the years. Could this be something that could kickstart our ability to unlearn and reevaluate? So, moving on to the presentation. Back in March 2009, the Harvard Business Review published an article asking when a process should be art or science. It suggested that managers had gone overboard with process standardization, that it had been pushed too far with little regard for where it does or doesn't make sense. They identified a few problems. Some processes naturally resist definition and standardization. And imposing rigid rules can squash innovation, reduce accountability, and harm performance. There was a recognition in the article that business is an ongoing cycle of art and science, and that both have an important role to play in business processes. So here are some characteristics to help us recognise what might be deemed as art or science in the business world. Very broadly, art is described as judgment-based work, whereas science leans more toward fact-based work. But even then, analysing data can influence the imagination to create something new, experiment with an idea, and gather more information to inspect and adapt. So this isn't an either-or situation, but rather a both and one. The activities of an organisation are commonly both art and science, a cycle, and they are heavily influenced by organisational culture. How often have you found yourself as a PMO person answering "it depends" to a question? So here are some examples of what I mean by artistic processes. You might not have immediately thought of these activities as examples of something artistic, perhaps until you consider the amount of judgment, knowledge, and experience required to be successful at them, and crucially, how to add value to that process for customers. So let's turn our thoughts towards PMO services. How would you categorize them? Do some sit comfortably as either art or science? Or are you finding yourself thinking it depends? Now let's think about the project life cycle. This is where I think art and science becomes really relevant for the PMO. This example is taken from the Praxis framework, which is open sourced and publicly available online. In any project management textbook or training course, great emphasis is placed on tailoring, the need to adapt to suit context and complexity. But in many of our realities, tailoring is conveniently ignored or forgotten completely, and best practice is held as gospel. It's not to say that upfront effort wasn't put into developing delivery frameworks and life cycles in your organization, but do those standards and processes provide enough flexibility to really add value for your customers? And when was the last time they were reviewed or updated to reflect the evolution within your organization? So digging a bit deeper, I visualize this heat map of the touch points that a project will have with the operating and monitoring services provided by a project office during delivery. We gradually get warmer as we progress towards delivery, then almost instantly go cold again as we get to project closure. No surprises that most of the touch points occur during project definition and delivery. But benefits realization and identification are quite conspicuous in their detachment. Then I focused on the services typically provided by the project office at each stage of the life cycle. So identification and sponsorship is where the focus is on why the change is needed and the benefits it will bring to the organization. A portfolio office will likely to be more involved at this point than a project office, and these decisions are largely scientific until someone in authority comes along and applies their artistic license to, say, JFDI. During definition, the focus is on the what, the who, and the how of the project that will deliver the change. There's a handoff from portfolio to project office as well. And if the roles are being played by the same function, that handover isn't necessarily appreciated. Configuration and financial management are fairly scientific project setup services, but quality, resource, and risk management, some elements of judgment and experience are introduced that don't necessarily lend themselves to checklist-based approaches that we often see during setup. The governance, stakeholder, and benefits management services also need to evolve in line with the context and the complexity of the project being defined. During delivery, the focus is on the when and where. Tasks are completed to complete and realise the change. Effective assurance is very much based on judgment and experience. To determine the overall health of a project beyond time, cost, quality, and the other traditional measures, and to predict if delivery is likely to go off track before it happens. Making a recommendation to stop a project at this stage can be as much about a change in operating context as a red, amber, or green performance metric. In closure, some project services reach a clear conclusion, but many others require judgment as to when an appropriate end is reached. Some need to continue beyond the delivery life cycle, such as benefits realization. And just like a project will move into BAU, an effective handover back to a portfolio office is key. Again, the subtle shift in roles might not be appreciated if the same PMO team are doing both. So looking at the life cycle as a whole again, I'd offer that the arrow that sits behind the project life cycle represents an increasing amount of complexity, as well as the direction of travel. You may have also noticed that some services didn't feature on the previous slides. Services that are ongoing throughout the project lifecycle, but do not directly impact the project delivery. Most of those services appear on the PMO's too hard list, alongside benefits management and resource management, which alternate for the #1 spot on that list. I would suggest that that's because they are complex rather than complicated. We find them hard because we try and use complicated approaches to solve complex problems. The quote that I read at the beginning of the presentation when I talked about Rick Nason's book really resonated with me from a PMO perspective. We try and use complicated approaches to solve complex problems. We come up against some problem statements when there's a perceived lack of flexibility in PMO processes. These problems are only magnified when we need an iterative delivery approach, which introduces even more complexity by being hugely dependent on context. So what do I mean by complicated and complex? The key characteristics of complicated and complex processes are listed here on this slide for you to digest at your leisure after this presentation. But the final points that are listed against complicated and complex really stood out for me when I thought about it from a PMO perspective. So I revisited the PMO services that we saw in the project lifecycle earlier, and I had a go at categorizing them. Unsurprisingly, those services that feature on the too hard list also appear on the complex list. It'd be interesting to know if you feel any differently about the categorizations here. But at this point, I do need to offer a word of caution against something called complexity bias. There's a cognitive bias and a belief that complex solutions are better than simple ones. And there's also an assumption that complexity always outperforms simplicity. According to Praxis, who we referenced for the project lifecycle, the project management profession tries to define complex and non-complex work in a very binary way. There is no definitive model for the different areas of complexity in project management, only the advice that tailoring is essential. It's vital to tailor all aspects of project management to specific circumstances, to use our judgment, to be artistic. But what about keeping things simple? Tony Robbins used this line to great effect to emphasize the need to keep things simple, and it's frequently quoted. We also need to be aware of being biased towards simplicity. In many respects, it reinforces a classic management paradigm that we'll take a closer look at in a moment. So how did we get here? PMI classifies PMOs into 3 different types: supportive, controlling, and directive. Research by Gartner indicates that most PMOs fall into the controlling bucket, with directive following pretty closely behind. A controlling PMO enforces compliance and is often known as the project police. A directive PMO has even higher levels of control. There's an obsession with metrics and measures, and a constant question about adding value. We need to take a closer look at the origins of command and control. Military theorists frequently turned to science to help understand and explain war. Most often, this science was physics and Newtonian mechanics, because they're well established and provide ready analogies for military forces. This Newtonian paradigm is so deeply ingrained that it's reflected in our everyday conversations. When things are going well, we say they're going like clockwork, a well-oiled machine, or that we're firing on all cylinders. We refer to our individual contributions as just one cog in a machine. Operations also has strong mechanistic connotations, suggesting the function of a piece of machinery with precise planning and procedure. Complex systems are in a continuous state of flux that cannot be controlled the way that machines can. Command and control is a dominant method of management in the Western world. Command and control is born from complicated mechanistic thinking. Command provides top-down guidance and control is through bottom-up feedback. We approach project management as complicated by default. We need to rethink command and control. Changing situations need continuous adaptation, and cooperation is essential. The trickier elements of project management are complex and need different approaches with some artistic thinking. Doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results might be called insanity. The irony is that many of us take this on board in our personal lives, but still manage professionally in accordance with some outdated paradigms. The organizations that we work with need encouragement to understand that healthy persistence requires some flexibility. So let's turn our thoughts towards how we can address this as PMO leaders. Over the next few slides, we'll look at some techniques you can use to improve results through relationships rather than coercion through command and control. First of all, there's this concept by the AI PMO of adaptive alignment. And it suggests that we as leaders account for the impact of external factors and drivers. We minimize disruption with incremental changes. We're seen to be listening and responding to business needs, and we're consistently providing maximum value. If we recognize that PMOs operate within an ecosystem, an open environment rather than a closed system like a machine. An ecosystem is a community that lives and interacts within a specific environment, like an organization. It's a complex system, and it adapts to external factors to guarantee its survival. Now, back in 2006, Jack Dougal presented a paper at the PMI Global Congress on the next generation of PMO. Now, he characterized PMO as a facilitating and enabling engine that helps to realize business objectives. And he suggested a framework to help integrate tactical and strategic elements, which he called the holistic PMO. Now, those tactical and strategic elements could also be thought about as art and science. We know that no one-size-fits-all approach to PMO design. We need to consider the environment or context in which the PMO will operate. Ensure that the structure and the service provision is tailored appropriately. Now, Cynefin is a Welsh word that translates as place or habitat. And it can also be used to describe elements of our situations and personal histories that influence our thoughts and decisions. I've used the characteristics presented in the last slide to characterize PMO operating environments. Now, an organization may well develop its own complexity model for its own range of work, but that model's unlikely to be applicable elsewhere. We've seen it with things like trying to shift the Spotify model. And one of the main reasons projects fail is that their complexity is underestimated. And this is particularly true when it comes to transformation. They're not just big projects or programs, but they need seismic shifts in mindsets and behaviors. Now, there's a word of caution here about asking our stakeholders what they want from their PMO. Stakeholder theory tells us that conflicting stakeholder interests create complexity. We also know that conflicts between stakeholder interests and influence also impact governance. Those that have only ever known command and control will naturally seek more of the same. And unfortunately, the mind wipe procedure from science fiction is just that, but it would be handy. As a PMO leader, you could also apply some systems thinking. Complex projects need both technical and managerial leaders who understand each other's needs and requirements and can consequently work in an integrated way. Systems thinking is a framework for seeing interrelationships rather than things. Now, moving back towards processes, a process matrix can help you to identify which of your existing PMO processes might be candidates for a more artistic approach. Just make sure not to confuse an artistic process with a broken process or one that is new and becoming established and does need some flexibility. Going back to the AI PMO's guidance that I referenced a little bit earlier about adaptive alignment, the principles and adaptive processes approach could also help you consider when an adaptive or an artistic process is more appropriate. The more complex something is, the less predictable the outcome will be. And on this particular slide, the scale on the left moves through increasing levels of complexity. And for those situations where more judgment and artistic processes are needed, the PMO principles that were published back in 2017 can provide some guidance and foundation for all the services and activities of the PMO. This is really useful for your team where they're trying to adapt their mindsets and behaviors to operate in this new artistic world. The most important principle of all is around the continuous improvement mindset. The PMO is constantly looking to improve itself and its contribution to the organization. It's really important to establish a way to inspect and adapt within your ecosystem. So now for some final thoughts. Almost a little bit of an existential crisis, perhaps, where I started to think, what a PMO actually exists for. I must admit that I often define the P in PMO as standing for people, the People Management Office. Relationships can make or break the success of a PMO. And a PMO can increase the perception of value by being a go-to place for actionable insights that are based on judgment and experience. The IPMO expert training characterizes a PMO as a broker of information and knowledge within an organization. So this is where my thoughts turn towards specialist insurance brokers who'll find you the best deal based on your individual circumstances and needs. Brokers start with data. They move through information and knowledge to tailor a solution for you. If all that could be done purely scientifically, and we didn't value the service that they provide, there'd be no need to call a broker. So I want to leave you today with some food for thought. Should processes be allowed to vary? There's some for and against arguments here. Conventional management training like MBAs suggests not. The idea that some processes should be allowed to vary flies in the face of centuries-old movements towards standardization. We need to be mindful of that Newtonian mechanistic paradigm. And a very, very popular question here. Do artistic processes add value? Some managers believe that they need artistic output when the vast majority of customers really want a standard product. There may be some additional value here for your PMO team, because there is research that indicates that more accountability means that workers are less likely to switch to autopilot instead of understanding or questioning the specifics of a task at hand. So finally, you can't do this all on your own. You need individuals with the right level of competence and capability to staff your PMO. You need governance and infrastructure to operate within, and capacity to deliver value-adding services. So have a think about your own leadership style. Do you issue commands to maintain control? Or do you delegate authority to unleash potential? Thank you very much. And that is the end of my presentation today. Do we have questions?
We certainly do. So we're going to head straight over to the questions and see what we've got. Thank you very, very much. That was absolutely brilliant. So interestingly, the questions are coming up on complexity, which I'm sure won't be a surprise, but let's start with Edwina's question here. Well, in fact, I'll let you read it.
On complexity, is the complexity to deliver the product or for organizations to adopt that product and realize their value? Interesting question. Both and would be my expected response. Just to demonstrate sort of trying to live the values that I've just talked about. Where we walked through the life cycle, what I was trying to illustrate there was the increasing amount of complexities as we move through the delivery, and how those interactions with PMO can sometimes hinder rather than help or be perceived to. But it is a wider issue in terms of helping the organisations to realise that value. And when I was highlighting at the end of that life cycle, that real sort of iceberg level detachment around benefits realisation, that there's definitely an area to focus on in terms of how the portfolio office can improve that.
Definitely. Thank you very much. Okay, next, another question on complexity here, and I think, again, something we've all come across. Complexity being
used to show others that they get their money's worth. Simple solutions or Occam's razor may not showcase skill and authority. It's a good point. I think that was why I was trying to highlight both sides of the biases in terms of us being biased toward complexity and complex solutions being better, but also being aware of that bias towards simplicity. We are forever hearing about how we need to keep things simple. And I do appreciate a need to keep it simple wherever possible. But again, it's a both and rather than an either or.
I think that's very, very true. And there's a danger of oversimplifying sometimes, but equally, you will see people make things sound very, very complicated unnecessarily. And it's an element of just adding to that, you know, making something look important, I think, sometimes. Here's another interesting point there around simple and complicated, but what about the chaos? Because there's plenty of that too.
Yes, I deliberately didn't go too deep into the whole chaos point, because I feel I could probably do a whole other separate presentation on chaos. I absolutely agree with you that there's a lot of stuff happening in projects that fall under that category, and it's really important also to recognize where we're being artistic, or we're addressing complexity and being flexible, or we're just firefighting because it is pure chaos.
Yeah, very good point. Okay, and we have one more around leadership style.
How can I know the leadership style that best suits my team? So I can offer some recommendations here. I don't know whether many of you are aware of something called the PMO competency framework. It is publicly available via the House of PMO membership body. Joe has one too. Working through that with your team is incredibly valuable. There's also an online tool that you can use to put all your results in that will help to tell you where the various strengths and weaknesses are across your team, but also for yourself, so that you can then hone in on those areas where you perhaps yourself need more professional development, or certain people within your team could do with that extra support. So I do really recommend getting a copy of that book and working through with your team.
Yeah, it is a fantastic tool for sure. It definitely is. Well, that's the end of our questions. I want to say thank you so much, Nicole, for giving us your time today. We really, really appreciate it. That was a fantastic session. And I know it got a lot of chat going as well as the questions.
Excellent.
I know people can find you on LinkedIn. Anywhere else that people should be looking for you? Where can we find your work?
Best place to reach me is indeed LinkedIn if you want to continue the conversation. The PMO professionals also have social media accounts across all the popular platforms where you'll be able to get hold of us. We also have a website and a contact form there if you'd like to pop a question on the contact form. But wonderful. Thanks very much for your interaction today, and I really hope that some of what we said today resonated.
I'm sure it will have done. And thank you everyone in the audience too for your participation and for coming along. And there's plenty of time for networking. Up next, we've got a panel discussion on the realities of PMO leadership. And we've also got a session in French on PMO entrepreneurship, which is blending these skills that we need in PMO leadership. So head on over to the networking areas, have a chat with each other, talk about some of the topics that you've you've seen already and that we've got coming up. And don't forget our sponsors as well. Keyed-in, Planisware and Asana are all in the sponsor booths. So pop over and say hello to them. And hopefully we'll see you all back here on the hour for the panel discussion. And again, thank you very, very much, Nick.